much for coming and talking with us.
Thank you for having me. Is that it? All right. Well, that is my introduction. And, folks, I'm really, really glad that Bob Mulder is here today because he was actually there in the Revolutionary War. So he can, I'm sure he'll be happy to correct me if I make any mistakes today, which I'm sure I will. So, every good talk begins with what? A pop quiz. All right, so here it is. When I say Revolutionary War, what do you think of in terms of people, places, and events? Revolutionary War. Rich Swanton, what do you think? No, Rich. People, places, events. What do you think, Dave? Boston, okay. Lexington and Concord. Did something happen there? Who else? George Washington, good one. Yorktown, good one. Benedict Arnold, great man. Great American hero. Yeah. Bunker Hill, yes. Anybody else? The Green Mountain Boys, great bunch of guys. Okay, so we have some wonderful answers, except there's one thing wrong with all those answers. That every person you mention, every event you mention, and every place, they operated within about 200 miles of the Atlantic seaboard. Well, what I'm going to be talking about today is a little different because there was fighting in the American Revolution as far north as Quebec City in Canada, as far south as Pensacola, Florida, as far west as St. Louis, Missouri. So, and if you think about when the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch came in on our side, 1778-79, it became a world war. So we had fighting in the Channel Islands between France and England. We had fighting at the Rock of Gibraltar, the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. We had fighting all over the Caribbean islands, the Sugar Islands. We had fighting in Central America, in Venezuela and Honduras. We had fighting in India. And of course, we had naval battles at sea all over the world's oceans. So you got to think in a little bit wider range if you really want to take in everything that happened and the effect that the American Revolution had on the world. We were in Australia a few years ago, and we were at the old convict barracks in Sydney. And remember, Australia started out as a penal colony for convicts from the British Isles. Why were they sending them to Australia?
To get rid of them.
Well, to get rid of them. But remember, where had they sent them before? To America. When we became an independent country, they couldn't send their convicts to us anymore. Where do they send them? To Australia. Australia is founded because of the American Revolution. So this whole thing has a worldwide effect. Now, I'm going to be talking about the war in the West. Okay, when I say the West, I'm not going to be talking about Colorado, Wyoming, or Montana. I'm going to be talking about western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, even a little bit of Missouri. And we're going to go actually all the way down to Natchez, Mississippi, and New Orleans. So that's the West that I'm going to be talking about. Now, remember, we people here in British North America are land hungry. Right, Bob Mulder? You remember it? We were because land, think about land as a source of wealth. Buying and selling land. Buying and selling the produce and the products that come off the land. Shipping those products to where they can be resold. All this involves a lot of money. We're land hungry. So even as early as the 1740s and 1750s, the British colonists in North America are thinking about the land to the west, the far western frontier. Okay, and the far western frontier is Kentucky, Ohio, what we would now call West Virginia. And at that time, as early as 1748, the British colonists got a land company together called the Ohio Company with a lot of investors. And they got a grant from the British government for 500,000 acres, 500,000 acres of land in what is now West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania. And this was called the Ohio Company. And a couple of the investors in this company were Lawrence and Augustine Washington, who were the older half-brothers of George Washington. Now, there was a rival land company called the Loyal Virginia Company. And one of the investors there was Peter Jefferson, the father of Thomas Jefferson. So all these relatives of the founding fathers of the United States, what are they involved in? Speculation and investment in Western lands. And that is how the French and Indian War started, because there were a couple of groups of people who already claimed this land. Of course, what would be the original group? The Indian people, the Native American people who lived on this land. They're like, what? You own it? I'm sorry, we've been here for 2,000 years. I don't think you do. And the other group of people who disputed this were who? Bob Mulder, who were out there? The French. The French had moved in earlier than the British. For about a century and a half by this time, they've been involved in the fur trade with the Indians. They don't want to displace the Indians. They don't want to cut down the forests. They don't want to create farms and towns the way the British colonists do. They just want to keep the Indians right where they are to get engaged in the very profitable fur trade and to make love with their women and to plant a few forts here and there and a few Catholic missions and to make love to their women. But we won't get into this discussion about the French, all right? So this is how the French and Indian War starts in 1754, and it lasts for 9 years until 1763. The British and their British colonists here in North America finally defeat the French and the Indian allies, and this is how it all ends up. This is how North America is divvied up in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War. You notice who's the dominant power in North America by far? Spain. Everything from the west coast all the way out to the Mississippi River is part of New Spain and the Louisiana Territory, which the French turned over to the Spanish so that the British wouldn't get it at the end of the war. Is there a pointer on this thing? Yes, there is. Look at that. How cool. And then all this, the British have gained control of Canada. The Hudson's Bay Company, an independent business, actually controls most of Canada on behalf of England. And then there are the British colonies along the coastline here. And then the British have established this Indian Reserve going all the way up into Canada. And in 1763, they put out the proclamation line that runs along the Appalachian Mountains. No white settlement west of that line. The British want to keep the same situation as the French had. They want to keep the Indians where they are so they can get involved in the fur trade, and they want to avoid conflict and trouble, which causes expense, which causes dissent at home. So here we are. All those Americans who invested in those land companies, all that money suddenly vanishes. And all these people who had invested are saying, what? The British government, you gave us the right to this land. And all of a sudden you're saying we can't take advantage of that? We can't move anywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains? I think this caused as much resentment leading to the Revolutionary War as what we usually read about in terms of the Stamp Act, the taxes, etc. So this was a main cause of ferment between England and the colonies. And the native people there are dozens of tribes living in this area, speaking different languages, with different religions, customs, and traditions. But I think there's one thing they're united on, and that is we're going to hold on to this land. And here's where they're located around 1760. And the people we're going to be mostly talking about today are mostly the Shawnee people, and with some extent to the Miamis The Delawares, you can see in 1760, they're located in Pennsylvania, but due to the pressure of white settlement in the 1760s and 1770s, they're going to be moving west into Ohio, along the Scioto and Muskingum River valleys there. So this is what's happening along the frontier, and there's a lot of ferment about what's going on there. What is the future of this West? Who's going to move in? Are the Indians going to stay there? Or are they going to be pushed out? What's going to be happening? And even some of the royal officials get involved in pushing beyond this proclamation line. This is John Murray, Lord Dunmore, who is the royal governor of Virginia. As you can see, he's Scottish. And Lord Dunmore is, shall we say, what's the word I want to use? I don't want to say bribed. Let us just say influenced by some of the people who had been involved in these land companies. And he instigates a war with the Shawnee people on the western frontier and leads a large group of Virginia militia into this area. And they have a big battle with the Indians at Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The Shawnee are narrowly defeated and cede a large amount of land to the colony of Virginia. So, there are also other land companies, I should say, that are involved in this. There's a company, some of the earlier land companies were reorganized into a group called the Great Ohio Company. And one of the main people in the Great Ohio Company was Ben Franklin. He was an investor in it, and he was a lobbyist in England, lobbying Parliament for a big grant of land west of the Appalachian Mountains, and they would form an entirely new colony, a new British colony called Vandalia. So there was a lot of ferment about pushing west, but some of the people who actually did it got involved in a land company they called the Transylvania Company. And in the aftermath of Lord Dunmore's War in 1774, they were able to get a large land grant from the colony of Virginia to create a new colony called Transylvania, the land beyond the forest, Transylvania. And there was a new roadway which was blazed by a particular individual who, in this wonderful painting by George Caleb Bingham, is leading the settlers into Kentucky through the Cumberland Gap. And we all know who the most important person was in Transylvania. Wait a minute. No, I don't know how that got in there. No, Count Dracula did not live in Kentucky, okay? Bela Lugosi did not have a castle. It was actually Daniel Boone, was the one who blazed the Wilderness Road from Virginia into Kentucky and was one of the great leaders of the settlers in there. And we have new settlements being founded in Kentucky: Boonesboro, Harrodsburg, Ruddles and Martins and Bryan stations are being founded there, and they mostly look like this. They're little compounds where the cabins are located in a rectangle or a square to provide a protective compound, and then with short sections of pickets put in between and a couple of gates. And they start to clear the land and they start to plant crops. This is in the early 1770s. Now, what's happening back east? We had Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. Who's from Concord and Lexington here? Somebody?
Close by.
All right, there you are. And so on April 19th, 1775, the Minutemen on the green at Lexington, Massachusetts, get into a little scuffle with some of the British troops who came out to confiscate their weapons and gunpowder, and that kicks off the Revolutionary War. And this has a big impact on the western frontier. Now, at first, this is 1775, it takes a while for the news to percolate out to the western frontier and the settlements there. And then we have a whole sequence of things where people are choosing up sides. Okay, think about it. What would you do in 1775 or 76? There's all these hostilities happening back east. We don't know how the Indian tribes are going to react to this. We don't know exactly what the issues are, maybe, but we're being forced to choose up sides between loyal to the king, which is part of our great British tradition going back centuries, or we're going to ally ourselves with this new group of people. George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, who are these people? Weren't they all involved in land speculation? Didn't they all want to become big landowners out here and lord it over everybody else and be part of the 1%? What side are you going to take? What side would you take? What do you think?
Go with the new guys.
You go with the new guys. Well, you're a forward-looking person. What about you?
I'd be against it then.
Okay, well, there you are. So it looks like you two are going to fight each other.
Out back.
Or who wants to just stay out of the whole thing? Raise your hands. There you go. So we have three groups of people. We have people who are loyal to the king and the British Parliament. We have people who want to throw in their lot with this new whatever the heck it is. 1775, there's no Declaration of Independence. We don't know what's going to happen. Are we going to go back in some way and negotiate and become part of the British Empire again? Are we going to become an independent country? Nobody knows. So everybody's choosing up sides. Everybody's running around trying to figure out what to do. But by 1777, it becomes pretty clear. The new colonists in Kentucky are pretty much loyal to the new government created by the United States of America. Declaration of Independence happens on July 2nd. Actually, it's adopted by Congress and then voted on July 4th. So we become an independent country, and most of these people chime in with that. In any case, they have to defend themselves because there are large raids coming down. The British are raiding. There's a man named Sir John Caldwell who has led a group of rangers down from Detroit along with her Indian allies to attack the Kentucky settlements. And the people there call this the Year of the Bloody Sevens because there's so many raids and attacks on the Kentucky settlements. The British control extends Detroit all over Michigan, all down into Ohio because there are major Indian villages there, and on to the west through Indiana, Illinois. There are some old French settlements there. And the person who is chosen by the colony, or actually the new state of Virginia, to take care of this situation is a man named George Rogers Clark. He's 24 years old, okay? And he is an officer in the Virginia Militia, and he is appointed by Governor Patrick Henry to take charge of the military affairs in the West and try to control this situation. And he formed a unit of Virginia state troops, not militia, but regular Virginia state troops called the Illinois Regiment. And he is also, remember at this time, until Kentucky becomes a state in 1792 or 93, Bob? You don't know? Oh my God. I'm saying 1793. Kentucky is still part of Virginia. So the Kentuckians are still officially part of the Virginia Militia. So he takes command of the Illinois Regiment, the Kentucky Militia, and he starts to react to what the British and the Indians are doing in Northwest. They attack and capture Vincennes in Indiana. They attack and capture Cahokia and Kaskaskia in Illinois. Vincennes is later recaptured by the British, but he and his men wade across flooded swampland in the winter, attack and recapture Vincennes. And the British governor there, Henry Hamilton, who is known as the hair buyer by the Americans because supposedly he paid bounties for American scalps to the Indians. He didn't really do that, but that's American propaganda. He is forced to surrender the fort, Fort Sackville at Vincennes. So Clark is beginning to gain control of this whole massive frontier area, from Kentucky on west through Indiana and Illinois out to the Mississippi River for the new United States of America. Now there's also action in Ohio, north of the Ohio River. The Delaware Indians in Ohio are somewhat sympathetic to the United States. So they have asked for protection from the other hostile Indian tribes around them. And in 1778, the Continental Army sends 2 units, the 13th Virginia and the 8th Pennsylvania, west to build a fort in Delaware Indian country along the Muskingum River in Ohio. And they call it Fort Laurens after the President of Congress, Henry Lawrence. And they don't do a damn thing. They are besieged all during the winter of 1778-79 by the Shawnee. Anytime anybody ventures out of the fort to chop wood or haul water or whatever, or hunt, they're liable to be cut off and killed and scalped by the Shawnee. Back in 1976, I participated in a ceremony here to rebury about a dozen men from the 13th Virginia who had been killed while they were out on a hunting party and were buried in a mass grave. We reburied them with honor and with a marker and a monument. So anyway, they were forced to abandon Fort Laurens the year after, 1779. So this amounted to not much of anything. Now, what did amount to something was, in 1780 and 1782, George Rogers Clark led the Illinois Regiment and the Kentucky Militia north of the Ohio to attack several key Indian towns located along the Mad River there, Old Chillicothe and Pickawillany, and they were able to defeat the Indians there, to destroy those villages and ravage their crops. So those people were forced to move north close to Detroit to get food from the British at Fort Detroit. So this did alleviate some of the pressure on the Kentucky settlements. The American strongholds, we had several real anchors to the frontier during the Revolutionary War. One of them was Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh. This is where the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers flow together to form the mighty Ohio River, right at the Three Rivers confluence, where Three Rivers Stadium is now. And this was a massive fortification. There's no way any number of British and Indians could have captured this place, at least not the numbers that they had available. And it was built during the French and Indian War by the British, but enlarged and strengthened by the Americans. And this is really one of the big anchors of American forces on the western frontier. And there were forts built all the way down the Ohio River too. This is Fort Nelson, which was built at what's now Louisville, Kentucky. This was built by George Rogers Clark and his men, and that was another anchor at the western frontier, farther west than Pittsburgh. So we had a couple of really important strongholds there. The British also did. This is Fort Niagara. Anybody here been to Fort Niagara? You've been? Yeah, it's a wonderful place, well interpreted. This was built originally by the French during the French and Indian War. This is the old French barracks, which is still there. And this was another massive fortification. Clark was always trying to get enough men and resources together to attack and capture Fort Detroit. But he was never able to do that. So this was another big fortification. The British had their Indian department headquartered at Fort Detroit. A tremendous amount of influence came out of this fort in terms of military and Indian alliances during the Revolutionary War. Then we had action along the Mississippi River. Now, believe it or not, it was easier for the troops at Fort Pitt to build boats, float down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, and then all the way down to New Orleans than it was to try to get back east over the mountains to get supplies there. So in 1778, that's what they did. There's a man named James Willing who had lived at Natchez, Mississippi, who got a group together at Fort Pitt. The soldiers built flatboats, and they built a armed gunboat called a rattle trap. And they rowed and sailed the rattle trap all the way down the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. They encountered, there was a whole nest of loyalists loyal to the king at Natchez, Mississippi. Did you ever think that there was Revolutionary War action at Natchez, Mississippi? But there was. So there was a battle between the men on the boat and the loyalists at Natchez. The guys on the boat won, plundered Natchez, and when they got to New Orleans, they sold their plunder and used that money to buy weapons, gunpowder, uniforms, etc. from the Spanish at New Orleans, and then rowed and sailed all the way back up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, got to Fort Pitt, and distributed the supplies to the troops. This was an epic voyage. Think about that, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, New Orleans, Louisiana, all the way back. How many miles is that? Yeah, Dave.
They would have had to row up against the current, too.
They would have had to row or cordel or pole or do whatever the heck they could to get back up those rivers. Think about that. So these guys were a bunch of heroes as far as nobody knows about them. Nobody ever says anything about them. But they're a bunch of heroes as far as I'm concerned. Then in 1780, a large force of British Rangers and Indians came down from Detroit and through the area in between there and St. Louis, gathering Indian allies as they went. And they attacked St. Louis. Now, fortunately, the Spanish governor there had built fortifications and was in the process of building some fortified stone towers. They still had construction equipment there. And because of this, and they had several cannon up in this tower, they were able to repel the British and Indian attack on St. Louis, Missouri, and across the river at Cahokia, Illinois, the British and Indians also attacked there. George Rogers Clark was over there with the Illinois Regiment. The British and Indians also failed there and were repelled with losses. So this was an attack. This was the furthest west action that I know of in the Revolutionary War, except the Battle of Lake Dillon out here in Colorado. You know, when the water is low at Lake Dillon, you can still see some of the sunken ships out there. I'm sure you've seen that, haven't you, Bob? You know.
Yeah, usually after I went to the bar.
Okay, well, now we also have a little action, and I'm kind of personally involved in this. This happened in August of 1781 in southern Indiana. The Westmoreland County Militia from western Pennsylvania were ordered to assemble at Fort Pitt, get on flatboats, and float down the Ohio River to join up with George Rogers Clark at Louisville, at the Falls of the Ohio. And so they did, and when they got to the mouth of a creek in southern Indiana, which is now called Lockery's Creek, they didn't realize they were being shadowed by a very large Indian war party. And they shot a buffalo on the bank, and they landed to butcher and cook this buffalo, and they got jumped by this very large group of Indians, and every single person was either killed, wounded, or captured. So I had the honor of portraying Colonel Lockery at the reenactment back in 1981, and I also had an ancestor who was spared by the Indians at this event, and I won't go into that in detail. If we have time, I can maybe come back to that at the end of the talk. He was spared for a particular reason. So this was a disaster, and then 1782 was a terrible, awful year in the Revolutionary War in the West for a number of reasons. There had been an attack by a small group of raiding Indians in western Pennsylvania on some farms there where some women and children were killed. And the Pennsylvania militia from that area were in a very vengeful mood. So they marched west into Ohio. There were 2 Christian Indian villages there. The Indians had been converted by 2 German-speaking missionaries from the Austrian Empire. And the 2 villages were called Gnadenhütten and Schönbrunn. And the Pennsylvania went in and gathered these Christian Indians while they were singing hymns and brought them forward and knocked them on the head and killed them. A couple of hundred Indian people, mostly women and children. This was a horrible massacre equivalent to the Sand Creek Massacre here in Colorado. So the Indian people in that whole region were not happy with this group. Later on in the year, there was another expedition led by Colonel William Crawford that came from Pennsylvania to attack the Wyandotte Indian towns along the Sandusky River in Ohio. They were cut off, surrounded. Many of the men were killed or captured, including Colonel William Crawford, who was the commander of this expedition. And Colonel Crawford was tortured for several hours before he died in revenge for what had happened here. It was a terribly horrible, gruesome torture of him, there are women and children here, so I won't go into what happened to him, but it was pretty dang awful. So it doesn't look like we're doing too well here on the frontier. Aside from Clark's victories, we have some troubles, and it's going to get worse. Okay, in 1782 also, there was an Indian attack on Bryant Station down in Kentucky. And when the Indians learned there were reinforcements on the way under the command of, in part, of Daniel Boone, they took off. And this large group of Kentucky militia decided to follow them up. And they got to a place called the Blue Licks, near the Licking River in Kentucky. The Blue Licks was a big salt lick, where the salt came to the surface of the ground, and animals would come there to lick the salt off the ground, and it was a good hunting area. It was very well known. You could also boil the salt that came out of the ground and create a good salt supply. So it was well known. When the Kentucky militia got there, they stopped and assessed the situation. And Daniel Boone said, I'm really suspicious about what's going on here, because the Indians have left us a real clear trail to follow. I don't think something ain't right. And I don't think we should scout out very carefully before we advance any further. Unfortunately, there was a hot-headed, drunken officer in the Kentucky militia named Hugh McGarry, who was on horseback, and he disagreed with this, and he said, anyone who's not a coward, follow me. So, of course, what are you going to do? And everybody follows him. Boone follows him and says, we're all slaughtered men, because he knows what's going to happen. It's an ambush. They fall right into this ambush. Many of the men are killed. They're forced to retreat quickly. Daniel Boone puts his son Israel on a horse that he has caught as it runs past to get him out of there, but the Indians shoot Israel Boone and kill him. Boone himself manages to get away. So this is a terrible disaster for the Kentucky militia, and 1782 is not a good year. It doesn't look good all over for the western settlements. But things are happening back east. So who mentioned Yorktown? You did, honey, because we were just there. In October of 1781, the British Army under Lord Cornwallis is surrounded and forced to surrender at Yorktown, Virginia, on Chesapeake Bay. And this is General Charles O'Hara giving his sword to General Benjamin Lincoln with George Washington there in the background, and over here is Alexander Hamilton. So this starts the process. The British are tired of this war, which has been going on by this time for 6 years, and they start peace negotiations in Paris. These are the American peace commissioners painted by Benjamin West, the American artist, There's Ben Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and I don't remember who these guys are. But anyway, do you remember, Bob?
It wasn't me.
Oh, you weren't there?
I was at the bar.
Oh. All right, well, now we know. It's part of history. But so they start peace negotiations, and eventually in September of 1783, the peace treaty is signed in Paris, acknowledging the independence of the new United States of America as free and independent states. And there's another interesting wrinkle to this that happens in the West, because here's how North America ends up in 1783. There's that narrow belt of British colonies, now independent states, and the British have ceded all this territory going out to the Mississippi River to the United States. All of a sudden, we were limited in a sense east of the Appalachian Mountains, but now we extend all the way out to the Mississippi River. And settlers start flooding into Kentucky and Tennessee. In the aftermath of this, there are still intermittent raids back and forth across the Ohio River, but now the settlements in Kentucky are relatively free of Indian attack. People can spread out and start to form farms and plantations, and the western frontier begins to really develop as an extension of the United States of America. And by the way, during the Revolutionary War, in an attempt to keep the Indian tribes to the west pacified to some extent, the United States government and the different states had promised the Indians there will never be any white settlement north of the Ohio River. Well, guess what? By 1787, the new government under the Articles of Confederation is desperate for money. They can't raise taxes. They can't levy taxes. Think about this, guys. If we had this same government, they couldn't levy taxes on you. Under the rules of the Articles of Confederation, the federal government couldn't put taxes on the people of the United States. Think about that. Maybe we should, but anyway. So how is the federal government going to operate? They have two sources of income. They have customs duties, which are supposed to be collected from the states and handed over to the government. What do the states do? Nothing. They collect customs duties, they keep the money, they never hand it over. Alexander Hamilton in New York is the customs collector, and he says, we never got a dime. So, what other source of money does the federal government have? Land sales. So in desperation, they form in 1787 the Northwest Territory, territory northwest of the River Ohio. And it extends from the Ohio River all the way up to the Great Lakes, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. And in conjunction with that, they form a government under General Arthur St. Clair. He's the governor of the Northwest Territory. And two land companies are formed to take advantage of this. And through a great deal of lobbying, this is the first lobbying effort in the United States history. The order for a well-regulated militia is what they think of as the backbone of the national defense. But there has to be some kind of regular army with long-term enlistments to form a basis for national defense. So they authorize 700 men. How many men are actually recruited? These men are supposed to be recruited from the state militias. How many of the states respond? 2. And how many men are actually recruited? 240. So our entire United States Army is 240 men. And they march out of Philadelphia river from Fort Pitt. And this happens to be Fort Harmar, which is located at the mouth of the Muskingum River where Marietta, Ohio is today. So this is the situation. We have this gigantic territory that's now part of the United States. We have a tiny group of military that is supposed to take control of this area. And we have white settlement beginning in a big kind of way north of the Ohio River. How do the Indian people feel about this? What are these people doing here? Didn't you say? Well, we're from the government and we're to help you. So, and this sparks off, by 1790, this sparks off a whole new round of warfare between the white settlers and the United States government and the Indian people of the Northwest Territory, and influenced by the British, who are still holding on to Detroit. They were supposed to give up the forts on the northern frontier at the end of the Revolutionary War, according to the peace treaty. They don't do that. They say, you didn't hold up your end of the treaty in some respects, so we're going to keep these military posts on your northern frontier, and through that, they're influencing the Indian people in the region. So by 1790, there's a whole new round of Indian warfare that begins on the western frontier. And maybe that could be the basis of another talk. So that's all I have to say. Any questions? Any answers? Yes?
What was the population during that time when they 240 defended
The population of?
of the white settlements?
Well, very low, very small. Just, I would say maybe around 2,000 people in the Marietta area and in the Cincinnati area. There were in Cincinnati. There was Cincinnati itself. A little bit to the east, there was Columbia, and then a little bit to the west, there was South Bend and North Bend. And those were the communities around Cincinnati. And then in Marietta, Belpre was the main settlement aside from Marietta. So I'd say there's about 2,000, 2,500 people at this time by about 1790. It's a low population.
So as you go up the Northwest Territory, then there weren't a lot more white settlements.
Yeah, they were. Sure, there were the old French settlements. There was Detroit, there was Cahokia, Kaskaskia.
So these 200 and some men were responsible for their protection also?
Exactly, yes. Although they did have local militias, and in Detroit, the British controlled the old French militia unit there, and they actually fought the Americans several times, the French militia from Detroit, at a couple of the battles that ensued after this time period. Yes?
Were men who served in the Continental Army provided land in Ohio?
Yes, yes.
That played a significant part of the settlement?
That was a huge part of the settlement of Ohio, because the area about from here to here, the mouth of the Scioto River to the mouth of the Little Miami River, it's about 1.25 million acres, and that was the Virginia Military District. Okay, and if you had served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War from Virginia, you got a grant of land in that area. A private got 300 acres. Think about that, 300 acres. That's not a little farm. If you were private, you got 300 acres. If you were a major general, you got 15,000 acres. Okay, the 1%, folks.
But they'd never been paid during the war.
Oh yeah, they had, sure. The Continental Army, you got paid $6 2/3 a month.
How many?
$6 2/3 a month in the Continental Army, which is not bad pay if you get it. Or how you get it matters too, because how they were usually paid was in paper continental currency, which is not backed up by gold or silver. So what's it worth?
It ain't worth a continental.
It's not worth a continental, right. And so that was a bone of contention all during the war. If you got paid paper currency. You might have $1 in continental currency. You go into a merchant store and he says, well, I'll give you 25 cents on the dollar. You're stuck. So it was not a good situation, but all that land that you got after the war was in some part a reward, yeah. And there was a lot of guys sold off their land certificates to speculators, you know, to get a little bit of ready cash instead of going out there and settling. Then it was a tremendous amount of speculation in Western land that way throughout the United States. So yes.
Whatever happened to General Clark?
George Rogers Clark continued to be extremely important on the western frontier. He was one of the founders of the city of Louisville, Kentucky. In 1785, he had a major negotiation with the Shawnee at Fort Finney, which was just west of where Cincinnati is now, on the Miami River. And it was an interesting occasion because they were pretty aggressive. They put, you know, a belt of wampum meant war. A certain design on a belt of wampum meant war. And so in the middle of these negotiations, the Shawnee got angry and they took out a belt of wampum, a war belt, and threw it on the table. And Clark looks at it, he takes his cane, he knocks it off the table and he steps on it. And they're like, oh, well, maybe we better think a little bit more about it. He wasn't putting up with this. So they had a successful negotiation there. So he was very important. He had incurred a lot of debt because he had paid for a lot of items, clothing, ammunition, all kinds of things, construction materials during the war, and was never reimbursed by Congress or by the government of Virginia to any extent. And so he fell into debt. He got to drinking pretty heavily. By the early 1790s, he was kind of desperate for money. Now, at that time, remember the French Revolution had happened. And the French had a very interesting ambassador here called Citizen Genet. And he was fomenting all kinds of trouble. And one of the things he wanted to do was hire George Rogers Clark, make him a general in the French army, and have him recruit troops, go down the Mississippi River, and capture a large swath of Spanish territory and turn it over to France. So Clark is a general in the French army. This is 1793. And fortunately, General Anthony Wayne, who was in charge of the American troops on the frontier, headed this thing off at the pass and ordered his troops, hey, stop any of these guys who are heading down the river. We don't want to get into this situation. So that was out of Clark. That was a project of his that was ended. And he ended up living, he was pretty much penniless. He ended up living with his sister and brother-in-law at their home, Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky. He had a real bad, apparently he got epileptic in his later years, and he had a seizure and rolled into the fire and was burned really badly and died in 1818. So it was not a real great ending for this great American hero, George Rogers Clark. Oh, by the way, his little brother, William Clark, became an officer in the Army and became the Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Yeah.
I know you didn't touch on the Navy, and you reminded me when I was thinking, talking about him, John Paul Jones ended up going to Russia.
You know, Bob Mulder taught John Paul Jones everything he knew. And, well, it's hard to talk about the Navy because we're not, I mean, aside from the Great Lakes, there's no naval action, except for the Rattle Trap, and also Clark had a whole fleet of gunboats built to patrol the Ohio River to try to stop the Indians and the British from crossing into Kentucky. So that, in a sense, Clark had his own navy. Yeah, yes?
Back to your relative under
Oh.
Colonel Crawford's command, why did the Indians spare?
Colonel Lockree's command. Well, Isaac Anderson was his name. He was from Ireland. He had 12 brothers and sisters, and they all emigrated to America. about 1770, and he had a farm in western Pennsylvania, Westmoreland County. So the revolution starts up, everybody's signing up. He says, "What are you doing?" "We're going off to shoot Englishmen." He says, "Sign me up." So they go off, and he becomes part of Morgan's riflemen. And at the Battle of Saratoga, he fights there, and then he's with a skirmish with the British down near Philadelphia. He gets shot through the face. Okay, they leave him there on the frozen ground. Next day, the British come through the area. Crap, he's still alive. So they take him into the British hospital in Philadelphia, and the assistant surgeon there is Irish also. And he says, "I'll take care of you of that. Just don't worry." So he nurses Isaac back to health, but he tells him to still feign being really ill so the British won't put him into a prison camp or whatever. So the British evacuate Philadelphia in the summer of 1778. He jumps up, puts on his clothes, goes out, joins his unit, fights at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. He said, "I discharged my rifle with aim 32 times during the battle," which for that time period, that's a lot of firing. But anyway, so his enlistment is up, he goes back to his farm, and becomes a lieutenant in the Westmoreland County Militia. Well, he's with that group that goes down the river, and they get ambushed. He gets captured. The Indians are going to kill him. The family story is the Indians saw these big gouges on either side of his face where he'd been shot through the face, and he survived. And what their thought is, this guy has some pretty strong medicine. You know, somebody's looking out for this guy. We don't want to mess with that, so we're going to let him live. So they did. And they took him up to, he and the other prisoners were taken to a prison pen up in Montreal, Canada, and he and two other guys escaped and walked to Boston from Montreal. And the diary of that escape and that journey still exists at the Cincinnati Historical Society. Because after the war, about 1795, he moved out to Cincinnati. He had a tavern on the waterfront at the sign of the Green Tree. And the story is, if there were Indians coming into town for treaty negotiations at Fort Washington there, he would grab his shillelagh and get his buddies in the tavern and go out and whale the tar out of these poor Indians. But anyway, he later became a very prominent surveyor. He surveyed the first state road in Ohio, which is still called the Anderson State Road, going from Cincinnati to Chillicothe, which was the first capital of Ohio. So there you go. Okay, are we done? Anybody? Yes, sir.
What kind of troop strength did Clark have?
He had about, he would have about 250 men in the Illinois regiment. And then he could have as much as 500 or 600 men from the Kentucky militia. Mm-hmm. Yes.
A little bit off topic.
Yeah.
The outfit you have on, is that authentic or is that a reproduction of what it might have looked like?
It's an authentic reproduction.
We thought you borrowed it from Bob.
What's that?
We thought you borrowed it.
Yeah, this is Bob Older's old uniform. The hearts are a decoration. On the full-length coat, the tails would hook together from the front and the back, and they had a hook and eye to hook them together. Well, then they put the little heart on to cover the hook and eye because they thought that was kind of unsightly. But what I have is a short coatee that doesn't hook. It's just sewn back, but they still kept the heart decoration. And the uniform is actually the uniform of the 13th Virginia, who were stationed at Fort Laurens in Ohio. And this is in a phase of the Continental Army under General Washington when they were trying to look like a European army. But here in America, we didn't have the large cloth manufacturing facilities that they did in Europe. So you didn't have enough cloth of one color to put the whole army into one color of uniform. So you have guys in blue, in gray, in olive drab, in white, in black, in green. You have them in all kinds of different colors because they're buying whatever bolts of cloth are available to them from the merchants. So the 13th Virginia got blue trimmed with yellow. And then it was piecemeal. The issues of clothing were kind of piecemeal because when they got a shipment of clothing in, whatever it was, they'd issue it out to the troops. So the whole unit might get coats, but their vests might be the vests from 2 years ago and might look like this, you know? So it was just a very difficult effort because of all the shortages and the lack of funding to get a uniform look for the entire Army. Yeah.
Obviously didn't have a button shortage.
No, they didn't. Right. That is true. Yes, sir.
When did the English finally give up Detroit?
English what?
Give up Detroit?
The English finally gave up Detroit in 1796. Okay, that's, the treaty was signed in 1783. They didn't give up Fort Detroit and the other forts until 13 years later, because John Jay, who was one of the treaty commissioners in 83, went over there as a special negotiator from George Washington, the president, to negotiate a treaty with the British where we'd finally settle this. And so they finally signed this treaty, which was very controversial over here. George Washington was condemned for signing this treaty because they felt it gave too many advantages to the British. But they finally gave up the forts on the northern frontier. General Anthony Wayne sent troops from Wayne's Legion in to take command of all these forts. And that's how it finally ended. Yeah.
Did they have any action up at Michilimackinac or Mackinac up in the Straits during this?
No.
They had posts up there, the British.
Yeah, the British had their fort, Fort Mackinac, at their Straits of Mackinac, which is between Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. Let's see, this is Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Michigan. Right up here is Mackinac at the Straits, and then this is Lake Huron.
That's Michigan. That's Michigan.
I'm sorry, where am I?
You were right on the Straits.
Okay, this is Lake Superior. This is Lake Huron. Lake Michigan, okay. I got you. All right, I'm glad so many people here. I was just testing you to see if... But anyway, no, there wasn't. Well, there was action there during the War of 1812, though, big time. Yes?
Well, I think we'll just kind of finish it off right now, but I hope you'll end up sticking around, and thank you, John.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe we can get you back for another talk.
Well, don't you want to hear the rest of the story? Okay.
But yes, we'd love that. And again, we want to present you one of our challenge coins to thank you for this. And I hope you'll all stick around. And again, you have a marvelous display up here that you ought to get a closer look at, and John will explain that as well. And I do apologize one thing. Normally I do give a better introduction than I did to John. And without going through all of this, for those of you who have the handout here, it kind of summarizes, a fabulous career and the experience that John has. And just to highlight a few, you'll have to listen. As curator and archivist of the Cincinnati Art Museum and Cincinnati Historical Society. And we heard a little bit of that from John's comments. But then he also became administrator of the Huron Homestead Museum in Evergreen. If any of you have visited that, that's a marvelous little museum. And then promoted to history, education supervisor, and region supervisor for the Bear Creek region. So I presume that kind of covers a lot of that area.
That's like Lair of the Bear Park, Mount Falcon Park, some of the other parks in that area, yeah.
So obviously someone who just loves history and would love to share it, and we very much would like to get you back.
Okay.
With that. One just quick comment as we were going through this. I recently have read two books which I found fascinating, which kind of ties in with this. One of them deals with the story of the British soldiers in the Americas during the Revolutionary War. And it was based on various diaries that soldiers had. And it changed my perception of a lot of what I always grew up thinking about the British soldiers. Another one dealt with what happened to all the Tories once the revolution was over. And again, basically, most of them fled to New York, and the British were faced with, what do we do with the 1,000 of civilians, you know, from there? And it's kind of a story of where they, you know, had to spread out all over the world to include India once this was over.
Right.
But, you know, very kind of marvelous other stories that tie into this. So maybe we'll look into this a little more later as well. So, yeah.
I was
Mark?
saying, John, if I were teaching American history, I'd want you with every class for about
Yeah.
3 hours.
Well, thank you, gosh. Thank you.
Thank you again. And please come and visit here and have some more refreshments.